Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. And also, like, kind of the goal of this last and final session of the UNESCO Bangkok OpenGLAM webinars was sort of the idea was to have some space for us to have an interesting conversation about some of the things that you have seen in the previous free webinars. We are kind of like, our baseline is that you have been participating or watching or listening to the previous webinars, or you are part of the UNESCO Memory of the World program and you're interested in kind of understanding more like the nuts and bolts, like the specific practical steps that you can actually take to implement an open access policy at your institution. So this presentation is gonna run, like we estimated that it was gonna be 90 minutes, probably it's gonna be less than that. But basically, the idea for this session is that I will be introducing some of the concepts and commonalities that we have found over the years with like different institutions implementing open access policies, and how you can actually like take some of those lessons learned and try to like follow that through inside your own institution. So I'm going to be doing a slideshow presentation for that. And then the idea is that we are going to have like a conversation about any remaining question that you might have of the previous sessions that we had. So we had like the introductory session where Fiona, Andrew, Misako, and Claudio sort of introduced the concept of open access. Then you had the second session on copyright, Creative Commons and rights statements, and then the first session on case studies. So if there was any question left from that session, like this is the right moment to ask any question around that. Either because you have a doubt around something that the participants share, or because you have like doubts or questions that you would like to get resolved before going out into the world and try to implement this at your institution. And in the last portion of this session, we're going to review with those of you who have completed um, um, completed that roadmap that you found shared. So if you have been like following the sessions and kind of doing your homework with that roadmap, we can review it with those of you who have completed and kind of go through like the questions that are there in the roadmap and see if there's anything else that you would like to see explained. Um, I hope that this is clear enough, but if it's not clear enough, please let me know in the chat box. And I am kind of like keeping an eye out there. But since now I'm gonna start my presentation, I might not be like looking at it. So are there any questions about this? I didn't introduce myself now that I'm realizing about that, but I can go ahead and also introduce myself, because like probably you're like, oh, who's this person that is like already speaking? So I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Evelin Heidel, but people also know me as Scan. I'm part of Creative Commons, like long-time volunteer member at Creative Commons, and currently I'm working with Creative Commons in the OpenGLAM initiative. And I have been involved in issues of cultural heritage and intellectual property for and digitization for quite a long time now. So that's kind of my background. And I also work with like several cultural heritage institutions trying to do digitalization projects. And so my background is like kind of varied, but always in the range of IP and digitalization and digital culture. So with that being said, um, I'll go ahead and start my presentation. So share screen. Let's see. So hopefully you're all seeing my presentation now. Can someone say yes? You found maybe?
Yes, we can see it well.
Great. And now you can say the full screen.
Yes.
Great. Um, cool. Okay, so I go ahead and like get started. So this is our last session on the webinar series. And the idea here is that we're gonna kind of try to look at some of the practical steps for implementing open access at your institution. And so that's like the how-to, right? Um, and I added there that this is like a discussion session because the idea is not only that I'm gonna present you this slideshow, but then we're gonna actually have a conversation and a discussion around like how can you implement some of the practicalities that other people have been sharing. So the way in which we design these webinars when Yufan and Misako and Andrew approach us, it was kind of like thinking, well, what are the minimal things that someone that wants to start an open access policy at their institution needs to know? And so that's the reason why we organize the sessions the way in which we did, did them. So like you started with session one, which was a very like interesting introduction to the relevant definitions in the field, like on open access, and what does that mean, and what are the different actors and stakeholders that are doing interesting things in the field. And then on session two, you went on directly into copyright and understanding some basic notions on copyright and how to use some tools like right statements and the public domain mark and CC0 and how the CC licenses interact with that and how they can be used to communicating copyright status of works. And this is something very important to kind of grasp that copyright is at the heart of every open access policy, right? Because if you don't have your rights clear over your works, then you cannot actually release any work. And so that's why we make so much emphasis on the importance of copyright for doing open access. And then we had a session three with a lot of dear friends where you had case studies and sort of experience sharing of how different people and how different institutions are approaching open access. And the idea now is that we're going to have this collective discussion. How do we move from some of these concepts into applying them in the practical realm? Um, so there was some logic behind organizing these sessions in the way we did it. And one of the kind of the main things that we always hear and we totally acknowledge is that every institution is different. There's no one size fits all. There's not any single institution that is actually equal or similar to the institution that is like maybe right across the block, right across the street. And so whenever we are talking about that, there are also, of course, like geographical differences. Institutions from Europe are not the same as institutions from Southeast Asia, and institutions in Southeast Asia are not the same as institutions in Africa or Latin America or North America. They vary greatly in a lot of different things, like they vary in the resources that they have, they vary in the staff and the capacity that they have assigned. They might have different organizational cultures, different levels of knowledge around certain topics and certain areas. However, we do believe that there are some commonalities despite the differences. And we acknowledge those differences, but we also are trying to kind of find what are the common topics or issues that all of them have to face when they are trying to do their open access policy. And so what are those commonalities? What are the things that all of them have to face whenever they want to go through the process of implementing an open access policy? And so these are sort of the things that we have been observing over and over. Like one of the important things that institutions have to do whenever they want to implement an open access policy is like they have to make sure that like staff and everyone that is involved with the policy actually understands what the policy is, understands the importance, understands what are the resources that are needed for implementing the policy, what are the different like logistics, capacity that has to be there in order to be able to have the policy implemented. So that's like the first thing that every institution has to go through. They have to make the internal case, like someone in the staff that is kind of like an open leader or open champion has to make the internal case to everyone that is involved in the organization. Then you have to actually prepare your collections and your content. What are the things that you're going to release? Under which terms? Are you going to release also your original materials? Are you only going to dedicate efforts to your public domain works? What is exactly that you're going to release, and how you're going to assess risk, and how you're going to like deal with any sort of challenge that you might face while you implement your open access policy. So that's like something that is like very important that every institution has also had to face whenever they had to implement their open access policy. And then there's like the fun part, which is actually like going through the process of releasing your collections and your content. And when you do that, what are sort of the things that you need to think and consider so others can actually understand what you decided and how you have decided to implement that. So is the policy clear for people? Is the policy clear for users? Is the policy clear for communities that might want to engage with your content? Are you making sure that people understand what are your expectations on how do you want to see these like materials being attributed? All these things are sort of things that every institution also has to go through whenever they want to implement an open access policy. And then there's like the final step or part where people actually, where institutions actually evaluate and sort of measure what's the impact of the things that they are doing with their open access policy. So these are kind of like the three broad four steps that we've seen that are common to every institution that is trying to do an open access policy or trying to implement an open access policy. So now I'm going to share like some kind of like more bulleted points of what each of these steps actually mean, and some resources that you can go and look and sort of like that can help you do some of these things. And I think this is kind of like, I won't necessarily go into details into any of these resources. I think this is more like I'm going to share this presentation with you afterwards in the side chat, and then you can go ahead and like look at all the resources that are there and start exploring. These are like resources that are kind of like the first step in a way that every advocate, open champion, like staff member working at an institution sort of like goes through and is like looks at and it's like, oh, okay, so this makes sense to me, this speaks to me, this might speak to my colleagues and staff and the communities that I work with. And so for making the internal case, there are some of like steps that are necessary. So of course, like the first one is like exploring the benefits of OpenGLAM, like what's exactly that I'm gonna get out of like implementing this open access policy. And this goes without saying like the obvious one, right? It's like, of course, Claudio and Misako and Fiona probably share in the first session, like it's important because it's important that you implement an open access policy because it's mission aligned, right? And like that's the kind of like first obvious benefit. But there are other benefits, and it's important that you sort of know them and like pick the one that really speaks to your institution, because every institution is different, and so the benefits that you might explore are going to be different. And the same is true for the challenges. What are the challenges that you might face when you're trying to implement your open access policy? And likewise, capacity, logistics, resourcing, and sustainability are going to vary greatly depending on your institution. And this is like very important, I think, to also be kind of aware, right? It's like whenever we're like talking about open access policies, sometimes it sounds like, oh, like that you have to put a lot of items on the public domain, and that's the way you do it, right? And sometimes that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes like you can actually upload a small collection of 50 photos into Flickr Commons and release those 50 photos with a public domain mark. And you're already being part of OpenGLAM and contributing to open access by doing that. And that's totally fine as long as it's like adequate to the capacity and logistics and resources that you might have, right? Because like you might not actually have a lot of resources, but those are kind of like small things that you can do despite not having a lot of resources. So whenever we are talking about like assessing capacity and resources, it's not about like, oh, doing what others are doing, but rather doing something that speaks to the capacity that you actually have at your institution and what is exactly that you can achieve with the resources that you have. Um, and then, of course, like very important is that you actually identify who are going to be the communities and users and stakeholders that are going to be involved in that process, if you have any. You might not have like any community there, but you might have, like, for example, the Wikimedia communities that have been kind of a common theme across all the sessions. Like you saw the presentations by Fiona and by Yvonne, Christiani, and so like Wikimedia is of course a very like important community, but you have to be in touch with them previous to doing the release. It's not that like you're gonna make the release and then like automatically the community is gonna show up. These are like relationships that you need to build beforehand, and that of course like also takes resources, so like you need to kind of have all these things in mind. And importantly enough, for helping build that internal case, it's like you need to also look for peers, allies, and examples. And that's where like the OpenGLAM survey Douglas shared in session 3 comes in handy, because like that is sort of the kind of the agenda or the list of organizations that are doing this that can help you get there. And you can like totally ask them like, hey, I want to know more about this. How do you do this? Or you can go to their websites and look how they build their FAQ, look how they are building their public domain guidelines, look how they are identifying items within their collection. So all these things like are sort of like preparatory groundwork for making the case to your colleagues and leadership that need to be persuaded that this is actually important, right? And like I'm sort of saying this because it's a lot of like work to actually get your open access policy in place. So you need to consider all these different scenarios. And on the side, you can see some resources um, that I'm leaving there that you can then go ahead and explore as you see fit. And as I said, these are kind of like resources that I think are really valuable because they are kind of concise and they speak about several different issues related to making that internal case. And then, of course, you have to go ahead and prepare your collections and content. And this is where copyright comes in. And this is like very important that you have a like not necessarily like a thorough understanding, because like for that like sometimes people actually go like full like take masters and PhD on copyright law and that, right? But there are some basic stuff that you can go through to make your copyright assessments and decide whether that's appropriate for your institution. So you need to plan for managing risk. You need to get yourself accustomed with copyright regulations and laws, and you need to give this a place in your institution. So you need to actually have someone in the staff that is not necessarily a lawyer, but actually understands some of the basics of copyright and like understand and has a general understanding of like how copyright works for digitization projects, and then how rights statements and Creative Commons tools and licenses work and how to apply each of them. And of course, like importantly enough, understand that there might be other issues that are not necessarily copyright, but that you might want to take into account whenever like you're preparing your collections to be shared. So those things are like privacy, sensitivity issues, maybe traditional knowledge issues, depending on where you are. And on that, and again, there are a lot of resources out there on some of these things. And I think the ones that I'm recommending there are kind of like the entry point for understanding a lot of the ecosystem. And some of them might be a little bit biased against like US law and the European like regulatory framework. But I think that they are still useful and you can adapt them to your own needs and to your own capacity. And importantly enough, I think the important thing about like some of these resources is that you don't need to actually reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of things that have already been done and that you can actually reuse and put into practice with some knowledge of your national copyright law. And then for the fun part, which is like releasing the collections and contents, of course, like importantly enough, you need to add labels, licenses, and marks wherever you have to like add them to the works and content that you want to release. Otherwise, it's impossible for search engines, but also for people to actually understand what are the reuse conditions of the works that you are making available. You have to explain your copyright policy, and not only explain, but you also need to like train people and spend time with people so they actually understand what they can and cannot do with your materials. You need to build FAQs, like frequently asked questions. You need to build terms of use and make sure that those terms of use are actually consistent with the labels, licenses, and marks that you have decided to use, but also that they are consistent across websites and platforms. So you can totally use like third-party platforms as Flickr Commons or Wikimedia Commons or other websites, Sketchfab, etc. Like all those are like fine platforms to actually share and upload your material, but you need to make sure that the policy actually makes sense all across the board. And there are some resources there that you can actually like reuse. And again, if you go to Douglas and Andrea OpenGLAM survey, there are a lot of websites there that you can explore more to see how they are communicating reuse to reusers. And finally, in terms of evaluation and impact, this is kind of like the fun part, right? Because like this is where you actually get to engage with communities, like engage with the different stakeholders that you have identified, engage with your user community, among others. And so this is where you're gonna kind of like measure your impact. And I don't know if Medhabi talked about this in her presentation, but you can do as little as like releasing a really small collection and then putting that on social media to ask for people to make gifts. And that can be your measure of impact, and that's perfectly fine. Like it doesn't have to be something like huge or like like the next reuse case study or project, right? It's enough that it's actually useful for you. And whenever we're like talking about impact, it's also impact that is meaningful for your institution. Of course, we all want to change the world and like have that sort of like overarching broader goal of like putting more into the common good. But that's like a super ambitious goal. So whenever we're talking about impact, it has to be something that is actually fit for your institution. So that's kind of like what I wanted to kind of gather around, like why we designed the webinar series the way we design it, because we see these commonalities happening over and over, and you can like take some of these ideas and see how they might speak inside your institution. So before we go to the doubt sections, I really want to make um, like I really want to show some appreciation here about the webinar series, because this webinar series wouldn't have been possible without the generous help of all these people that have been with you in the last 4 weeks. Starting, of course, with Misako Ito and Yufan and Andrew Henderson from the UNESCO Bangkok and the Memory of the World Community Asia Pacific, Claudio Ruiz, Fiona Romeo, Yvonne Cristiani, Ivy Lee, Brigitte Vecina, Elliot Vleso, Partha Pratim, Tomaki Watanabe, Douglas McCarthy, and Medhavi Gandhi. So I want to say thank you to them. And like, I know that we are in a Zoom call, so it's kind of weird to like clap, but I want to clap in sign of appreciation for all the knowledge and expertise that they have been sharing. And so after that, now I suggest that we open the space for conversation. And this is sort of like ask me anything moment. So you can ask me questions about the presentation or about the presentation that the rest of the sessions and participants have had, or if there's anything in particular that you are interested in talking, this is the moment, and I will stop sharing my screen now. So I'm gonna close this, and I'm gonna change the settings for sharing this, and so anyone with the link can view. And so I'm gonna put this in the chat box. So there you have access to the presentation. And I see that there's a question there. Yeah,
Yes, can
Misako.
I? Yeah, thank you, Evelyn. And I mean, on behalf of UNESCO, I would also like to thank you because I understand you are talking from Uruguay, right?
Yes.
And it must be 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning. So I really want to thank you for your commitments to have these webinars for to switch the participants for our region. So really, thank you very much. And yeah, I wanted to raise one questions about the standards of OpenGLAM, because we have seen in this webinar series the principle of open access. We have discussed about the Creative Commons licenses. We have seen the case studies, and where the standards for open access to GLAM collection stands today. I mean, do we have some agreed common rules that institutions can apply to their collections? Is it something that's under preparations? Um, I would like to know about the development of the common standards that so that we can understand where it stands and how when we can use those standards to apply for the institutions.
Well, that's a great question, and it's a complicated one to answer, because I think that let me like think a little bit. So what we have seen is like we have already like 10 years more or less of institutions, um, GLAM institutions doing open access. So kind of like one of the first institutions that actually started applying CC licenses was the Brooklyn Museum in the US, back in like I think 2003 or 2004, something like that. And we have come a long way from that moment. So it's very interesting because I think that right now we are kind of at the brink or verge moment or like transition moment where there is like more and more a common agreement and understanding about what are these standards that you are mentioning, right? And I think one important standard that people or like institutions that want to participate in OpenGLAM have sort of agreed on is that digital reproductions of public domain works should remain in the public domain. So you shouldn't add any additional restrictions to the digital reproductions of works. And this is particularly important for artworks, objects, all these sort of things that are kind of unique. So an important agreement, I would say, is that like don't add additional restrictions on works that are in the public domain. The other important standard that we are seeing more and more is that whenever institutions want to follow through that principle of not adding more restrictions to public domain works, they choose the CC0 license or the CC0 tool, more properly speaking. And they choose that even because when we're saying like you should not claim rights over digital reproductions, it actually makes sense because in some countries, in some regions, digital reproductions actually receive some type of copyright. So what we are seeing is like basically that public domain works should remain in the public domain, then use CC0, and then for metadata, use CC0 too, because whenever you are releasing metadata, if you add any other component of attribution, you make it really hard for any person that wants to reuse that data afterwards, right? Because they have to attribute and like it creates sort of like a stack of attributions in a way. And whenever we are like talking about releasing metadata, it doesn't have to be anything fancy in the sense that it doesn't have to be like an API. It can be like a spreadsheet. It can be a data dump that you generate from your database, your content manager system that you use at your institution, right? And so what we are seeing is that institutions like have different practices there, but the thing that we recommend is like use CC0 as to avoid like all these attribution issues. And then there's like the other part, which is the content that the institution generates. And so in there, like there are a lot of varying practices, but in order to be considered open for the open standards, like you actually need to use something that abides by the open definition. And that's something that Douglas talked a lot in his talk, but I'm there putting it in the side chat. And basically, that means that you are allowing for any use with any purpose, including commercial purposes. And there are like different reasons around why these recommendations are being made. But and we could explore them if like anyone has like doubts around that. And importantly enough, another sort of standard that it's kind of like implicit, I would say, in a way. It's like whenever we are like talking about these issues, it is also important to consider the technical standards. So like copyright is very important because it's actually like the thing that it's gonna allow users and reusers to use the materials that you are sharing. But then they have to have the technical ability to do that. And so that means that if you are sharing the works with a really like low resolution, for example, then your policy is inapplicable because people can actually not reuse any of the materials and content that you're sharing. So that's like a very important aspect too. So like you actually need to have some minimal technical standards in place. The data needs to be reusable, and the images or artworks or whatever format it is that you're sharing has to be reusable, so people can actually like apply the policy that you are releasing. So that's like the first part, like that's all the evidence that we have. And we're going to be putting more of that evidence soon or at the openglam.org website. But we're also preparing a declaration on open access for cultural heritage. And I want to invite all the people that are participating in this call and are part of the UNESCO mocap that they get engaged with that. We're going to be uploading some information soon on the 20 of October, 21 of October. We're going to be updating our OpenGLAM.org website and giving people ways to actually provide feedback. And so this process has been, Dr. Andrea Wallace is preparing a research paper that sort of like gathers around all this evidence that I've been talking around about and kind of explains what has been happening in the field and looks a little bit like what else we could be doing, but also what are sort of the minimal consensus that we need to agree on. And our plan is that this research paper and the whole declaration is going to be open for consultation for people to actually provide feedback and comments. And then we expect to have a finalized text somewhere in 2021 with an initial draft by December 2020. So that's kind of where we are right now. I hope that, sorry that it took me like and I also see that Michael said that like this is the first of the decisions that he's attending. And Yufan shared the link to the previous sessions.
Hey, Scan, it's Andrew here. How are you? Hello.
Hey, Andrew, how are you?
Yeah, good. Thanks so much for the presentation. I'm just wondering, like, what are like some of the first kind of practical steps after this kind of webinar series? Like, when we go back to our museums or archives, like, what are some of the first like steps that you recommend to do, like almost that we can action in the next month or so? You know, like, is there anything kind of practical tips or hints that you can share?
Yeah, so I guess that one of the things that I would say is like I think that the first thing that I presented there on the slide deck, it's actually important. Like making your case is one of the most important things that you will actually need to do. Because if there's not buy-in of the rest of the staff and the colleagues that you have to work with um, around like the importance of doing open access, then it's actually quite hard to achieve that. Um, and there are different ways in which you can build that case. And for different people, it's gonna work differently. And also, importantly enough, it also takes a lot of time. It might take a lot of time. Um, but I would say like the first thing is like kind of go ahead and explore what others have done. And what are the things that you are interested and that you think that are gonna really speak to your institution. Um, so, you know, looking at all the things that the different Wikimedia projects have done, for example, and what are some of the things that you can achieve with that. I don't know, there are other examples like the Coding Da Vinci examples, and kind of go and see some of the reuse possibilities. What is exactly that OpenGLAM kind of allows for to happen, right? And help build that case and like the arguments for persuading others. You can either unmute yourself, or if you want to ask any question on the side chat. We can also talk about copyright if you want. If anyone has a question about copyright, or about the CC licenses, or about the CC tools, or about right statements.
Hi, Evelyn. It's Yufan here. Actually, from last session, there was a question left in the exit survey by participants. There was a very difficult question asked last week that if some small institutions, they want to digitize their content and they want to open their content, but they don't have resources, like how can they find resources or like get the project funded? That's a very hard question. And actually last week, all the speakers were not really able to answer that. Would you be able to address this question?
I mean, yes, that's a hard one. And what I can do is like, by any means, like, don't take this as like, oh, you know, I'm gonna provide like money or anything like that because I really don't have anything. But I can help, like pointing out to some resources. So, and this is gonna take me a little bit because I'm gonna like be typing and searching those for you. But bear with me. So the first one that I will look to is the Center for Library Information Resources. They are an institution based in the US. I don't know that they necessarily have any program based in Asia, but they do have some programs in the Global South. And they particularly have a program that is called Hidden Collections, Digitizing Hidden Collections. And so that's like one program that I would go and look to. And they also fund PhDs and fellowships. And that's like kind of important because like they can help bring some PhD fellows, and they do often bring PhD fellows to um, uh, archives fundamentally. Then there's the Endangered Archives Program that some of you might be familiar with. And the Endangered Archives Program is from the British Library in the UK. And they provide money and they fund mainly archives that are at risk. So that's like important to consider, right? They are not going to fund, at least this is my understanding, they are not going to fund more contemporary things, but they might be able to help if you have like a rare collection that is at risk. And importantly enough, I want to share something that they did that I think it's amazing. So even if you don't have a lot of resources, they published a book in 2018 that is called, let me see. Um, yeah, so it's called Remote Capture. This is like, you like take a look at the resources guides because they are very nice. They have like very interesting things there. And their book, Remote Capture, Digitizing Documentary Heritage in Challenging Locations, has a lot of like very practical steps on how you can actually start planning for your digitalization project. And so even if you don't have a lot of resources and if you don't have a lot of money, the fact that you can actually like create a good plan for how you're going to go about digitalization, it's actually like interesting. I particularly like participated for quite a while in the do-yourself book scanner project, and I think that Yvonne and Wikimedia people have been sharing some of that, right? And so if you're actually dealing with like text and written materials, you can go and like read a little bit of the resources guide that the Endangered Archives program has, and then go and look at the do-yourself book scanner thing and sort of give yourself like a good idea of what are the things that you can actually achieve on a shoestring budget. So of course, like we always say, like, yeah, like high quality, it's important, but you can also actually do a lot of things that don't like require a lot of like high quality. But for that, like you need to be kind of aware of where the good thing, like where are the things that you can achieve and like do a nice assessment, right? And so what I recommend there is like kind of like using these free resources together. So the Endangered Archives program resources guides, the do-it-yourself book scanner, and then use the Apache guidelines, right, which are done by the Federal Agencies Digital Guidelines Initiative that they are based in the US. And they are like very good standards for solving some of the technical issues, right? So kind of understanding that. And then the University of California in Los Angeles has an endangered archives, modern endangered archives program at the USL Library. Oops, sorry, Christine Curry was sharing that with me as I was speaking. So you can go and check that one too, and they also provide funding and resources. And also importantly enough, the Endangered Archives program from the British Library is actually has a call open right now. And then another interesting partner that it might be a little bit more complicated because you actually need to have money for working with them, but like you can go and like look what are their solution is Internet Archive. So Internet Archive has different types of partnerships where institutions actually don't have to pay like the full amount that like different digitization sort of devices cost, but they can like pay for a fee, and like they have different arrangements for working with institutions across the globe. So they are an interesting partner to take a look at in order to be able to see and explore what are the things that you can go and do with them. They used to have like global books type of thing. And then the other one, of course, is the Wikimedia Foundation grants. The only problem with the Wikimedia Foundation grants is that they actually don't necessarily fund, they don't necessarily fund digitization per se, but they might actually be able to help with putting together some other project that then can allow you to free some resources or staff inside the institution. And like Wikimedia is also kind of its own community in a lot of ways, right? So for example, we didn't have Rupika here, but Rupika, she's at the Open Heritage Foundation there in India. And Rupika, for example, she's working with different libraries in India to actually digitize some books. So this is mainly books, and I know that it's kind of like it's not necessarily like the materials that most archives have. But partnering with a Wikimedia community is also like a good way or option to try to get some funding. So I hope that that like gives a broad overview of what can be done.
Yes, that's perfect. That's like really many resources, and thank you so much. And I think there are two more questions in the chat box.
So, okay, so Susan is asking, how do you incorporate open access notices in library catalogs or let clients know what they can do with their resources? Okay. So that's a great question. And I think that there are like many ways in which you can do that. So basically, like there are many ways in which you can do that, but importantly enough, try to use standards whenever you can. So whenever we are talking about open access, then that means like using some type of CC license or a statement that actually resembles a CC license. So for that, there are like different recommendations, and there are like different things that you can go and like look at, right? So for example, in the slides that I shared, Europeana has published their public domain guidelines, right? And that's like a way in which you can like say to reusers, like, look, this is how I would like you to credit or attribute the work, right? And then there are other ways in which you can do something similar. And like, for example, the Open Access Initiative at the Smithsonian actually has a very thorough and comprehensive FAQ that they have done. But it doesn't need to necessarily be like that, right? And so I'm gonna share with you another very interesting conversation that we had a couple of months ago around how you can actually like attribute, for example, on social media, and how you can let users know that your collections are open access in different social media platforms. Um, and so it will all vary according to your institution and what are your institution needs. But basically, like if you're going to be using a third party platform, for example, then you're going to have different ways in which you can actually put those statements. But the most important thing is that whenever possible, try to mark at the item level that the item has a CC license or a CC tool applied to it. And then in your terms and conditions or in your FAQ, explain the overarching policy, right? So that's what like, yeah. So I hope that makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense, Susan, feel free to unmute yourself or write a follow-up question on the chat box. And I can share another example. Yeah.
And there's a question from Christine Curry. Uh, and also I see Michael Teague raising hand.
Yes. Okay. So, Christine, are there any plans to develop more rights statements that are closer to CC licenses? In example, like non-commercial and education use allowed, or non-commercial, non-derivative, but has copyright. Okay. So Susan says that I've answered her question. Great. So in terms of right statements, so I really don't know. Like I cannot speak for right statements because I'm not part of the consortia or anything like that. I'm very familiar with the right statements, but I'm not actually part of any of the working groups with them. So whether they have plans of developing like new right statements or not, I'm not sure. I do want to like say something, however, that I think that it's important because I don't know if this was like touched so much in the conversations that you had with in like session in the session about copyright. It's like why we are recommending to use right statements and CC licenses and tools. So basically, we're recommending to use those two set of tools because CC licenses are not supposed to be applied when you are not the copyright holder of the work. So in order to apply a CC license, you have to be the copyright holder of the work. So I cannot put a CC license to a work that I don't own or that I didn't create. And so unfortunately, that's the case for many GLAM institutions. So GLAM institutions are, or cultural heritage institutions, are commissioned to take care of works that they haven't created in the first place. So they actually don't have the rights to those works. And so that means that they have to have some way in which they can actually communicate the copyright status of those works that are not the CC licenses, which are supposed to be applied only when you actually have the rights to those works, right? And so that's the reason why rights statements were created in the first place, because they allow the cultural heritage institution to communicate the copyright status of those works. And um, generally speaking, there are like three categories of rights statements, like in copyright, no copyright, and then other, right? And so in copyright, all the statements that fall under that category are works that are still in copyright, but somehow can be displayed, either because you're using them under a limitation and exception, or because like you can use them for commercial use, or because the rights holder allow you or authorize you to display this work under certain conditions, right? And then for objects that are not in copyright, that might mean that they are in the public domain, in which case what we recommend and rights statements recommend is that you use the public domain mark or the CC0 public domain. So you should use any of these two for communicating objects that are in the public domain. And then like they have the other category that is like for things that they weren't able, like the institution might not be able to determine whether they are in copyright or not, or they didn't have the time to actually conduct a rights clearance process or an assessment. Um, and so what Christine is basically asking is like, oh, like, is rights statements planning to expand the rights statements that they currently have for in copyright objects, right? And so to be frank, I don't know, because I'm not like part of their working groups or whatsoever. Um, but I think that their non-commercial and educational use rights statements kind of come pretty close to or are very similar in communicating that you are only supposed to use these words under like by not making commercial use or any other. And of course, like I think that the reason why they haven't added something similar to the non-derivatives, and this is me sort of like speculating around this issue, is that if it's in copyright, then it's a given that you actually are not allowed to do derivative works of those works.
Is it okay if I ask a question now?
Yeah, of course.
Thanks. I'll see if my video works. So I'm based in Vietnam and I'm working for a university. So it was interesting to hear some of the examples of maybe how we can use our institution and our students to maybe support some of the GLAM sector in Vietnam. A lot of them have digitized, but they haven't made that next step into accessibility, which is, I think, where we can help. One question that comes up from my kind of the management is, but what about the maintenance once we get it online and accessible? Because the university is a bit reluctant to have to long-term continue the maintenance. So when something like that happens with other institutions, is it handed back over to the GLAM organisations, that ongoing maintenance? As I'm just, those kinds of things that if I'm aware of how other organisations maybe have done it, then I can give a better answer when I'm going to get these kinds of projects up here.
Yeah. And sorry, because I think that I've been mispronouncing your name during
Okay,
the whole
no worries,
session.
it
I'm
happens.
sorry about that. So, it's Michal, right? What's
Michelle,
the
yeah.
proper way to pronounce it? Michelle. Oh, okay.
Michelle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So that's actually a great question, because I think that for some institutions, like they can actually like do the work of digitizing, but then they have like a lot of trouble like putting the stuff online, right? And so that's where they sort of get stuck sometimes because they really don't know what are the options that they have, right? And so for that, fortunately, unlike funding, there are many, many, many more options that they can explore. And like some of them like have like different kind of like varying needs and ways in which they can be stored. And so it will all depend like whether we're talking about like multimedia files, where we're talking about text, where we're talking about like what are the different things that we're kind of talking, right? And so here I'm gonna sort of share some of those things. Like I think it's totally okay if like GLAM institutions like upload their materials to third-party platforms, right? I think that creates like challenges in terms of like, oh, long-term preservation and thinking about how these objects are going to be preserved with time and all that we know that can be very complicated. But if you don't have any resources, like this is maybe something that might even be in your horizon, and you have like a very specific need that you want to sort of share this content, but you don't have where. And so for that, like I'm gonna paste there in the side chat a bunch of like places where you can like share that. So of course, the first one is Wikimedia Commons, right? I'm pretty sure that both Fiona and Yvonne share a little bit about that. The only problem or the only caveat with Wikimedia Commons is that all your stuff has to be either in the public domain or has to have a proper CC license. So you can actually not upload stuff that has copyright there. The other one is actually Internet Archive. So Internet Archive not only has like their digitalization program and their scribes and all the like devices for doing digitalization, but they are actually a platform for storing content. So I know that there are several institutions that have sort of created their kind of like website, like their space inside Internet Archive, and that can be visited and used. And there are other options. I've seen pretty much everything that is out there. I've seen institutions like using WordPress for what it's worth, right? So actually, there's like an interesting development being done in WordPress, which is the like never ever say that I recommended this, but like never say that I recommended WordPress as a platform for uploading like materials, right? Because like some people like feel like have feelings around that. But there's this plugin that is being developed by the I think it's the Brazilian Institute of Museums, or something like that would be the translation. That so far I have received like very good feedback from it. Of course, like this is kind of like a little bit more complicated because it might mean that you need to invest in like actually putting some resources into building your own things, right? So Wikimedia Commons and Internet Archive, you don't have to put any resources in building any of that. You just use the platform and that's it. WordPress, even Omeka, like those things, you need to pay or invest resources in like building some of those things. And then, of course, last but not least, like you can also use other platforms, right? So Flickr, even if it sounds a little bit outdated, you can use Flickr for uploading all your images. And Flickr actually has like this sort of like special section that is called the Commons, and or Flickr Commons. And in this section, they actually allow for cultural heritage institutions to upload their materials that are under a public domain mark. And I would say that there are like different options according what are the things that you want to share, right? So if you don't have any resources, you cannot invest in building your own expensive platform. There are a lot of things that you can like use too, right? And I know that that might create like complications from the perspective of digital preservation, but unfortunately, that's not necessarily something that like can be solved. Like if you cannot like even have a platform, it's kind of hard to actually have a plan for digital preservation probably.
Just, I have a question, just more about how we can access the presentations like after the meeting. It's like, maybe this is for Masako and Yufan, but will the videos be up online, or can we get access to all the presentations?
Yes. Hi. We will upload the recording in the same playlist that I shared the link before in the chat, and for the slides and presentations, we'll as well as since Evelyn shared all those useful links, so we'll find a way to share all the resources as well as the slides from the previous speakers. Um, we'll share it, and we'll maybe send out like a group email to everyone who participated, and or put it under the description area of the YouTube recording. But they will all be shared for sure.
Thank you.
I'm also leaving my email there in the presentation. So if people like want to drop me an email, they have my email address there on the presentation too. Okay, so Susan is asking, is there a way to embed CC statements into the resource itself? Sort of pops up when you mouse over besides watermarks. So first, I would strongly encourage or discourage the use of watermarks. I recommend using watermarks. There are a lot of like better ways to actually get the attribution back to your institution if that's what you're trying to achieve. The problem with watermarks is that they are actually not machine readable. So like search engines and all the technologies that are sort of like using that for like reading what content is free and available on the internet can actually not do anything with the watermark. So from that point of view, it's kind of not very useful. And the best way is always to try to put any rights information, any attribution information in the metadata of the file. And so you have all different ways in which you can do that. And that's actually like easier to retrieve for any purposes of machine readability. So around like ways of like embedding CC statements or write statements or CC licenses, right? So a lot of it will depend on what is exactly the type of content management system, digital asset manager system that you're using. Different people will call it different ways. But basically, if you're using some type of like standardized language and some type of like content management system that is actually designed for working with collections, you will probably have rights field. And in the rights field, that's where you would normally put what we call the deed or the sort of like, yeah, the kind of the statement itself, right? Like the URI, the uh, permanent identifier of every single statement. So, and there are like different ways of going around this, right? So of course, like a recommendation is like whenever possible, try to mark this at the item level. But I just want to show you like real quick. Let me search one statement so I can show you actually. So for example, this is the in copyright. statement, right, of the right statements. And let's find like the CC0, right? And this is like the CC0 data. So this would be the things that you would put in the rights section or rights information, depending on what is the standard that you are using for cataloging in your different like management systems, right? So a lot of it will depend on what are the like tools that you're using. And for sure, I can share a lot of examples on how different people are doing this. And there are like some very interesting things out there, but it will require me a little bit more searching. So I can definitely, what I can do is like I can add some slides at the end of the presentation if you're interested, that I can share. And I can also like recommend that you take a look at some of the webinars that we have been doing around some of these things. So there's this webinar, and then there's this other webinar that we didn't do, but that you can watch because probably has all the information that you need. And then there's another one that I want to share real quick. But yeah, basically like there are different ways in which you can do this. And what I would also say is like go and use the survey too, right? Remember the survey that Douglas shared in his presentation, in the FAIR presentation. I'm copy pasting it again there. But if you go and like use the survey, you can explore how different institutions are actually communicating rights in their different platforms. So a lot will depend on what is the platform that you're using. Hopefully that answers your question.
All right. I think there's no new questions raised. So everyone who would like to join this photo session, I would like to invite you to turn on your video, and I'll take a screenshot at like I'll say 1, 2, 3, and we may share this photo on UNESCO Bangkok's social media platforms. So I see more and more people are turning on their camera. Okay, okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Yufan. Thank you, Evelyn.
Yeah, thanks for everyone for being here. And again, thanks Misako, Andrew, and Yufan for all your work in organizing this series. And I hope that we can learn afterwards that it had some interesting outcomes. So yeah, thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah.